The one thing about when I look at grazing the bottom line is the fact that it's so easy to just count on grazing because it grows every year for you. Now, did everybody's grazing grow for them this year? Not such a good year? Well, that's one of the things. We start noticing it when it doesn't happen, when we want it to happen. And certainly from that side of things, to me, this is an area I think that fits so well with social license. It fits with all of this because it's simply a win-win-win. And the opportunity to look at it from the perspective of where it fits in the financial picture is huge. Forages, to me, give so much of a door opening into the consumer side, a door opening into the environmental side, a door opening into the profit side. And I'll talk about the profit here today. So how many people had pastures that looked like this spring? Only 2. You guys are lucky. 3, well, 3 I guess. The fact of the matter is things maybe turned green, but they didn't grow up too much. And this pasture, of course, the unfortunate thing that always bothered me about it was when I looked at the ditch, and I know we got the lights a little higher so you can get me videoed for the video, but you can't see it as well yourselves, but the ditch was actually growing better. So you think to yourself, well, what's going on here? And that's certainly something that I look at because I think there are a lot of opportunities here, and it all deals with economics. So has anybody been out hunting grasshoppers this year? Oh, you did. Season started early for the November 1st for you, I bet, eh? Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's one thing I'm worried about for next year, too. And I know from that standpoint there was a lot of grasshoppers in different places. And certainly we do know that managed grazing has less grasshopper issues than continuous grazing systems. And that is work done out of Montana, out of the research group in Montana. So there's some opportunities there to deal with it. I know this fall we're trying to leave our upland areas, grazing lowland areas, so we hope we're going to have more residue, more litter on the upland areas. Not as great a place to warm up a grasshopper and get them started in the spring. So the residue side of things is something that works a little bit against it. Why it's so important to have moisture in the springtime in a perennial forage system is because it starts growth so much earlier. And the reality of that is also, how many of you out there have converted old hay fields to pastures? So how many people have seeded a pasture to be a pasture and never had it as a hayfield first? 2? 3? The thought to a lot of this is that when we start looking at these old hayfields, we know that they evolve and change over time. And we go to grasses that are, in fact, more grazing resistant. The grasses that don't require as much nutrients. And a lot of that translates into grasses that only grow early. And the production we get early determines the bottom line economically for the year. That's why spring is so crucial. It is more ways than that because we get the sunlight, we get the growing degree days coming in June. But the point of it, that's why spring and management of forages for the economic bottom line is so important. And one thing I noticed, and this is our place, but you look at the alfalfa plants, and they grew. And I wished I had it all in alfalfa. The grass that's in between was hardly anything. And then slowly came to the point now where it looks like I've actually got a pasture there. That was grazed early. This pasture picture is taken in August and late in August when the grass finally started to come from the rains. But the reality of it was the legumes were the ones that would have been the drought avoider. The legumes were the ones that would have been the pasture I could have grazed. The legumes were the ones that would have addressed risk management and my bottom line positively. And so that's one of the things we'll share a little later in this study, in this discussion, because when we start looking at profitability and the economic bottom line of grazing, of course, you're getting into a whole story, a can of worms that we can talk about with a lot of potential. One thing I wanted to show you, and this is from our production economics work, Dale Khalil, and Dale's retiring on the 12th, and for those of us like Ted Nyberg and myself, I know we've really enjoyed all the stuff Dale's put together over the years. Because when he does, he tries to look at it from a forage side. And what he looked at here was the yellow is Alberta total, the green is the low-cost producers that were surveyed across Alberta, and of course the red is the high-cost producers that were surveyed across Alberta. These are cow-calf producers. They're not selected to be forage producers. They're cow-calf producers that were willing to put their numbers forward for them to be analyzed. They spent a week getting those numbers ready for Dale to be able to cut out to the bottom line. Dale pulled the grazing side out of it. And that's something we've enjoyed, because when you look at that, you can see right away, one of the ways in which people were dealing with the whole BSE issue and other things, grazing contribution to profitability, we could see that the green line, the low-cost producers relied heavily on grazing to address their profitability. So the low-cost producers relied on grazing to address their profitability, whereas the high-cost producers in the latter stages started to. The point that I wanted to show to you is look at the green line, look at the red line. Long-term average profitability of the high-cost group, long-term average profitability of the low-cost group. The low-cost group who relied on grazing for their bottom line. And their profitability in terms of up to 65 cents per pound of calf weaned returned to equity. That's why I look at the grazing side as a huge win-win. The more we manage for it, the more it gives us the profit we need to get young people like you students out on the land with the farm operation, succession in its works. When we started the Western Forage Beef Group, and I was part of the group that started it in 1996, it was a group of extension and scientists from across Alberta getting together with a producer advisory board that came from Saskatchewan, BC, and Alberta. When we looked at the bottom line to the beef industry and tried to determine where we should put all our energy, all the beef people that were sitting there were converted to more of a address the feed, address the forage, because it was the bottom line to the beef industry. And that's where we started the work on so much of the stuff that we'll share a little bit with you later, where the grazing bottom line, the economics of year-round grazing was looked at. Now, I wouldn't recommend this to you guys because this guy didn't get away with it. But it is expensive to deliver feed to cattle, especially if you're doing it across the border illegally. You can see those white bags? Yeah. That was an expensive proposition when he got caught. But if he wouldn't have got caught, maybe it would have been the most profitable. But the point of it is expensive to deliver feed. Very expensive for this guy. But for somebody like Jim Kemp sitting in the audience, how expensive is it? Well, here, Jim, here's your answer. If he's got 100 cows and he's got 1 hour to feed those cows a day, and he's taken out 2 bales of hay, 1,500 pounds each, do you think it cost Jim $60? Well, if it was, that's 60 cents per cow day. Just taking the feed out to the cows. Do you think that you could do it cheaper than that? You know, that's the challenge with it. We find it's pretty realistic, and it gets pretty costly pretty quick, because that is not feed. That is the cost of feed delivery. Assuming that you start the tractor, you warm it up, you get it going, or the bale truck, you've got depreciation on it, you've got all those good things that go with insurance and repairs and all that. Lo and behold, it costs money to deliver feed to cows. One of the things Kathy Larson looked at was the fact, and this is way, as we listened, I think, this morning to what Brian Perlet was talking about, herds are getting larger. That is one way to address the cost. Spread it over more units. If Jim was hauling feed out to 200 cows, would it take him 2 hours? Hopefully Jim would work harder. It'd take him an hour and a half, so he'd be getting a little bit of a benefit from that. The thing that worries me so much about those people looking at doing this is the fact that Don Campbell said at one time, you got to ask yourself why. If you don't ask yourself why then, am I going to make more money if I've got 150 to 200 or 300 cows? Or am I going to lose more money faster? So that economies of scale is true, but it doesn't let us off the hook of why we do things. And we had a gentleman at the course yesterday said, you know what? I start my tractor and use it every day. And he said, my way's the cheapest because I've got a 5,000 head feedlot. And then he went into explaining why. And yeah, I agree. Once you're putting that tractor over all those hours of work, it started in a heated shop, he informed us too, so repair bills aren't as bad. But he's using it over a lot of units. So that makes a big difference. Now you kids, I don't know which one of you came up with this idea. It must have been on a Friday morning or something. We heard, I don't know, I think it was Sean saying something about A&W. Well, these students at Olds decided to do something about it, if I'm not mistaken. So I found this on the internet the other day. And the fact is that, we've got people watching what we're doing, and the reality of some of that is that as they do, I think we've got a bit of a win-win in our hands. And certainly, even from the wildlife side, if this bear really was wildlife, it looks like somebody's taking care of it. That's why I let hunters on my place in the fall and don't think twice about it. Somebody should eat those deer, I say. And the year-round grazing book was what we pulled together, and I'm going to talk about economics across just not the summer, the winter, looking at it as we move quickly through our time. And Rick, you're going to keep me on line and try to give me kind of a halftime notice too, please? So anyway, what we're looking at there, this looked at all the seasons. We had 5 producers that Agriculture Research and Extension Council of Alberta followed across the province, all the way from Fairview down to Castor, actually, in that area, the Handhills, I should say, and down to Irricana and back and forth. All those producers did a whale of a job with grazing management in the summer, too. But so much of what we saw with the year-round grazing was people took the winter side out of it and started using that. And the summer side is a little bit more work at the wrong time of year, so a lot of people didn't take advantage of that. But that's something we're hoping to do a little bit more with a current project we got on the go. In this book on page 38, this is on the website on the ARICA, Agricultural Research Extension Council of Alberta website. Page 38, you can find all this. It was on the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, Alberta Beef Producers. I don't know, Fred, if it's up there anymore at all. No? But we looked at the yardage costs because that to us was the hidden side. We can always price out feed, but what is it? And when we did, we tried to compare Macintosh apples to Macintosh apples, is what I said. So often we hear that, what is the cost to do something? And I'll hear people telling me, and they're comparing grapefruits to Macintosh apples. And you can't do that. When we did this, we found some things that were quite distressing. Why would stockpiled grazing be not as good an advantage as swath grazing? And that's 2000, so that's old. And people said to us, you have to redo this and do it when it's more current. What I'll try to do for you here today is approach that a little bit. We didn't get it done this summer, but I wanted to get started on it. Straw chaff bunching, grazing that grain land, bale grazing, not as good an advantage, but all of that translated into being better at the time than the costs that were the yardage. So that's back in 2000. So to today, how many of you think yardage costs have gone up or gone down? Up? Up, yeah. Well, and that's what we kind of think too. So let's look at it. The thing about that, when we looked at 200 days, and again, Macintosh apples to Macintosh apples, I wouldn't be straw chaff bunching grazing for 200 winter days. Maybe it only gets me 60 days. With my brother at one time, I know it was getting him a month. And he calves in January, so he could still do that and supplement with a bit of silage. And certainly from that standpoint, if I did it for 200 days, cost per day, looking at savings per pound of calf raised, if I raised a 500-pound calf, I could cut 40 cents per pound of calf raised off the bill. What that says is, if that was my alternative versus traditional feeding, I could go to the marketplace, I could sell my calves and olds here at the market and take 40 cents less per pound and still have the same as my neighbor who traditionally fed. This is some of the economic grazing bottom line that I think allows the young people to come back into operations. Some of that translates into doing business differently. So anyway, that's the point to it when you look across it. One of the things I wanted to show you is why isn't stockpiled or banked forage, all that is growing perennial forages used in the late fall or winter. Why wasn't it the best deal? Can anybody tell me why they think it wasn't the best deal? Because I swore it was. I don't want Ted to answer this. I swore it was when I started doing Dale's. We were using his producer pool data from beef producers across Alberta, and I stayed with all of his data and pulled the data. Owen Nelson and I pulled it out of Dale Khalil's stuff. So it's beef producers across Alberta's numbers. The productivity at that time of that beef group varied from 0.05 animal unit months of yield in a perennial pasture to 1.3. 0.05, if you want to call it that, times 30 days in a month, that's 1.5 days per acre. That was all the productivity some people had on pasture. On an acre pasture, 1.5 cow days of grazing. At 1.3, it was 45. 1.3 times 30 works out to 45, roughly. So the point of it all was production was very low. You can't put any cost across nothing and expect it to be low. It's not expensive to graze a perennial pasture that grows every year. But if you've got a bit of taxes, a bit of fences, a bit of checking those cows, all of a sudden, you don't have a profitable alternative. When we looked at the swath grazing, as you saw there, 47% of the winter feeding cost of traditional only. Labor, 44%. Why? We're looking at a cost savings opportunity of feed and yardage at that time in the mid-90s of 80 cents versus $1.51. Mid-90s. What we did find was that producers spent only 25 minutes a day managing cattle. Labor cost, $15 an hour, 25 minutes equates roughly to $7.50. Traditional feeding, a full hour. The point of it all was we'd cut the labor cost back. We'd also cut out the machines that ran to the field or whatever. So swath grazing did that. One of the ways they did it was from high yield. Now, as we asked, do we think that yardage has gone up? The reality of yardage is that in the 90s, what did you pay per hour to get machinery fixed? Elvin, what did you pay per hour to get machinery fixed? I'm not saying if you did it yourself. 90s. 85 bucks. What do you pay today to get machinery fixed? 120. So if Elvin should find Joe's low-cost mechanical, because I think Joe there would do it probably a lot cheaper. Joe's only overhead is the car that keeps the rain off his back. But, he might not do the best job. You might have to take it back and forth a bit. But the point of it all, is, I'm joking here, is that we know that there's a lot of things about yardage that you know. If anything, it would have gone up from a cost of machinery repair side, hours, depreciation on equipment, all the equipment costs more and such. What Dale shared in this slide, and you can read everything that's there, but all he's really saying is that everybody's unique. The relationships you have, the opportunities you can do, the fact if you're at Fairview or if you're at Irricana, you got different options. The interesting thing to a lot of this, when we did the workshop, Cow-Calfenomics up in Grand Prairie last year, one of the people came up to me and said, after I'd done the talk and I was talking about bale grazing, and they said, we couldn't bale graze, we had too much snow. And that was the 2013-14 winter. And then we had our producer speaker get up, like you're going to have later today. And he told everybody how he swath grazed in 2013-14. He was young, and he decided that he and two of his neighbors got together. They built a plow for the front of the tractor. It wasn't the cheapest thing, but he opened up his swaths. Then it was his responsibility to get it to the next guy. And the next guy did. They worked it in a 24-hour shift. He had it for about 8 hours. The next guy had it for 8 hours. The next guy took it to the next guy. And by next morning, he said the plow was sitting out at his house again to use again for the day. The fact is, one person could do it, one person couldn't do it. Why? Innovation, ingenuity. I put this down, and there's some, you can look at it a lot of different ways. The biggest thing I look at for winter grazing options, economically ranked, is I've got to do a good job in summer. The reason I do, if I put fat on that cow's back, she has less energetic requirements in winter. I can do more things with her. She eats even less. She's less stressed in winter. When you look at cow bites in the program, the first thing you start putting in wind speed, cold weather. She's in a different country when she's got an extra ½ inch of fat on her compared to the cow that doesn't. Great summer pasture production is a base. The other thing is we switch the calving season. We'll talk a little bit about this, but the reality is when they did the survey looking at Western beef producers, they now realize the majority of people have shifted to an April calving season back from where they were in February and March. Those were the two next times that were more popular. But we've gone later. And that makes sense to me after being in the business for 30 years. I can see where we calved earlier, now we're back to calving a little later. But we can also feeding a different cow because of physiological requirements. I can feed her differently when she's not calving until the end of May. I can't feed her differently if she's calving in January maybe. But my brother proves you can, even that. So there's still angles to say you can do it. Crop aftermath. This is one of the biggest areas you look at, and I think that Brian touched on it briefly. Certainly, and I've got some handouts on the side that talk a little bit about crop residue and things like that. It's interesting because when I looked at that, and we'll talk a little more about it in a minute, it is an opportunity to look at. Not all these fields are seeded acre to acre. The swath or corn grazing are two areas that have always been popular, and certainly from the corn side of things, it's a growing trend. The swath side of things, there's some tricks there, and again in the handouts on the side you'll see some things. And again, we're looking at yield here to spread units of cost over, because they cost more. Annuals, now we're even getting situations where people are planting all kinds of annuals trying to improve the soil. Again, fits well for social license, some of these cocktail crops that the Foothills Forage and Grazing Association are working with producers on. And so are the Grey Wooded Forage Association working with producers on. Where do they fit in the game? They kind of sound bizarre, but there's some things about them you can talk about. Bank perennial forages. The question I put here is that I look at them a little bit carefully because I realize I have to have productivity per acre. Is that half, Rick? And when I'm looking at them, I have had producers come back to me and say, wouldn't I be better off running 2 yearlings on that same ground where I'm going to run a cow for a winter? And they'd done the math, and you know what? He was right. So bank perennial forages, where do they fit in the picture of economic bottom line? I'll show you where they do in my mind. And then, of course, bale grazing. And bale grazing doesn't save as much money in years of higher feed costs. It's a disadvantage probably even to you. But there's things about it we've found over time that I never thought about. And one of those things is it really does turn a pasture on its ear and make an old hayfield that was losing productivity pretty productive. Now, I don't know if this comes across well enough, but I suppose for you students, that one size fits all probably is a good enough size. I wouldn't mind having a large size too, I guess, if I knew you, but the reality of one size fits all, it usually doesn't. We've got to look at a number of systems and things. So maybe it isn't the same pub we want to go to, maybe it's not even the same drink, maybe it's not even the same grazing options, because we've got another opportunity in our community to take advantage of. Maybe it is a bunch of lowland that can be grazed at different times of year. Maybe it is, in fact, a crop option because we got cereals and oilseeds as part of our rotation. We can graze residue on it. The one thing that bothers me greatly, as we often hear said by a lot of the people in the industry, is that what we have to do is we have to run a conservative stocking rate, a low stocking rate to take care of our land. What they're doing when they say that is they're sentencing you to a low life of low profit. I'm sorry, I have to have production per acre. I have to manage it well thereafter and use it wisely to have high profit. But if I don't have an ability to run a high stocking rate, you're sentencing me to profit controls. The thing about that to watch for, though, is I'm not talking grazing fresh air and sunshine, because many people have you heard that joke before? I hate to pay for cows enjoying fresh air and sunshine. Well, in a lot of pastures that you rent, you find that that's exactly what happens. By the time they're there and they pull them off the pasture, they've been out of grass for 2 weeks or something. To me, yeah, that increases stocking rate on paper. It hurts those pastures. It also hurts my bottom line. So I'm not saying grazing forage that does not exist. And that's why with the swath grazing and corn, we're looking at yield. We're not just saying leaving them out on pasture when there's no yield. So when I look at stocking rates and saying it equals profit, I'm saying you've got to grow the forage to have this high stocking rate. You've got to manage it to have the high stocking rate. You need the moisture management. You need the fertility. You need the species. The old hayfield that's lost productivity, the old pasture that's been grazed into the ground for a lot of years before you rented it from somebody, I'm sure it wouldn't have been yours. That pasture doesn't have a good start at an economic bottom line. This was from the survey that was done, the cow-calf management survey. One thing it showed is that producers were increasing rotational grazing. 67% said they rotationally grazed native. 70% said they rotationally grazed tame. Then you looked at bale grazing, 33%, and this was a mix. If you did this and this and this, then you were additive. But the fact of the matter is that the bale grazing, swath grazing, 17% across Western Canada said they swath grazed, 18% grazed stockpiled forages, crop residue, 17% said they do it. So producers were responding back on the survey saying they did extend their grazing season with those systems. So part of that is because of BSE, part of it because producers had no choice but to change. My concern to a lot of that as they fill that survey out is that we still look at those alternatives in light of the profits they gave us in the past, because we still need those profits here today more than ever. And it is easy what the US went and did, and you think, my God, they had a gravy train because they never had any BSE. Yeah, I know a story on that one. But the point of that is they didn't have to change. You guys had no choice. You were out of the business unless you changed. Or you better have a government job like mine. But the point of it all is that the US never rose to the occasion. You look at their cost of raising a calf now compared, I don't know if Brian's got it here. I've seen some numbers coming out of the U.S. lately, and I think, boy, they've got an expensive. We're cheaper than them. Why would we be? We got longer winters, more snow. It's because they don't have to be. Anyway, part of this comes, we have to put the picture together. Grazing is all evolved around rest and planning. When I look at this picture, if I say I paid $5,000 an acre for that land, then I look at, and I wish these pictures showed up better, what I'm seeing here is a plant that wasn't grazed at all. So if I said this field had a bunch of this, half the field was not grazed at all, the other half was grazed again and again and again and again and again and again, and the cow came back and grazed it again, she came back and grazed it again. What we're looking at there in that one picture is land that was not used within, land that was abused within. The productivity off of this was probably 40% of what it could have been if it had been managed well. That didn't have any harvestable yield, largely, unless the cows were held on long enough until they consumed that finally at the end of the year. So I look at that picture and I say to myself, we have to create forage mass. Remember, stocking rate. We have to create mass in any type of pasture. So the economic bottom line doesn't matter pasture type as much as it does pasture management of. If we grow forage up, we get carrying capacity, we get profit. And with that, we look at the other pasture, and he grew that spot, I guess, to be grazed later in the year. And this spot, he grazed very hard. What I'd rather see, instead of that mature grass there to be grazed in October or November, I'd rather see that mature grass, which, yeah, it's not the best quality, but you can see the green that's down the bottom. There's seed heads and everything, but they had a lot to eat. And just like anything, I don't have to have all dessert. I can eat a regular beef meal with some vegetables and everything and do quite kindly, thank you. So the fact of the matter is, he might not like it as much, but what he's got here is lots to eat versus that where he's got no choice but that. Stocking rate does affect economics. Management does affect the economic bottom line. When we're looking at grazing, one of the things, Dwayne McCartney put this together and he said, look at all the options we've got in different parts of the year to explore. Lauren Erickson said, you know what if you put the cow in after you looked at your grazing alternatives? And that was another put your hat on backwards kind of moment, because when do you calve? When do you wean? That's all up to you to decide as you use those resources. And we've seen shifts. What I wanted to show you is the old hayfield. When we look at that old hayfield, if we keep it down for 5 years, don't fertilize it at all. Accept the mineralization of the soil, assume we're going to get 2 tons of hay yield per acre. What are we going to take off of it in the hay we pull off? 350 pounds of nitrogen, 100 of phosphorus, 450, 40 of sulfur. Now we're going to turn around and make that a highly productive pasture. It's pretty hard to make that a highly productive pasture when it's starting from a disadvantage like that. I'll just skip by this. The thing I look at when I've got a cow out on that land is I'm looking at a nutrient return of urine and manure in the summer, and this is using October 2015 numbers. I phoned the co-op in Innisfail and asked them, what's the price of fertilizer? What goes in one end of the cow every day that she's eating, sorry, this is the winter. My apologies, this is the summer. I made a mistake on that. She's eating in the winter 30 pounds of a grass hay, I said. 35 cents is the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. 37% of that is returned nitrogen. When I go to the summertime, I recapture 60%. Again, we're talking about social license in my way of thinking. We're talking about nitrogen, we're talking about fertility reuse. The reality of the phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, our grazing bottom line can be quite profitable if we manage to put manure and urine where it came from. And a lot of that becomes a lot easier when you're managing pastures with rotational grazing, with water, with cattle. Keep them out of the bush, keep them out of the riparian areas, put it back where it makes the most difference. We're talking a benefit that is just plain a bit of work. Some of that comes from maybe grouping cow herds. The advantage in these old bluegrass pastures across 5 sites in Manitoba, Don Green did this work back in the 90s. And continuous grazing was only giving 943 pounds of production. The rotational grazing that they managed on those sites with rest and such, 2,500. So they more than doubled yield. Then when they put some fertilizer with it, yield went up another notch. So talking about pasture fertility, I always look at management first because I'm a cheapskate. If I want to use fertility, I want it to be my ice cream on the cake. I'm too cheap to try to use fertility to replace management. The reason why that's important, this work, all I want you to look is these green things. Dwayne McCartney's work back when it was done at Melfort, he found that he increased forage production 2.5 times with fertilizer levels. So let's just think levels instead of numbers. The thing he also found over, instead of having that negative carryover effect that I remember when I went to college, Friday mornings were a bit of a carryover effect on Thursday nights. I think Alvin and Charlotte probably is the same thing. Maybe more with Charlotte, I'm not sure. Anyway, 1.5 times more forage in the second year with no more fertilizer added. Recycling, the cow recycling. That's what you're finding. So when I look at the cost of fertility, I want to look at it fairly. I've got 2 years of benefit, not just one. And I got to play with that. That's the science side. To a producer, it might be in the riparian area, it might be in the trees, but you know, we're looking at that. The thing when I look at stockpiled forage and seeing where, to me, the first thing is budget conservatively, like people have said. Low stocking rate, no. Managed stocking rate, yes. I plan so I'm going to have enough grass to get around. I start in manipulating and changing things in the year as soon as the weather doesn't look like it's my friend. We held the yearlings, we held the young cows where they were supposed to go out and graze. The older cows went out and grazed April 14th start. The herd was supposed to. They didn't. Why? The fall was dry last year. Not for the grain farmers, it was in my pastures. And I knew it wasn't a good start, so I wanted to be careful and manage carefully. And lo and behold, that side of it is what we're talking about. Trying to manage your way through. If you have a surplus, that's fine and good. That surplus can be used in the fall, or in fact next spring to calve on, or to put cows out. We're going on a straw grain ration. We know the cows aren't going to like to eat straw in April, so they'll be back out grazing in April instead. So I won't ask them to eat straw in April. They'll be eating straw probably in December, where I wish I didn't have to, but that's the way it goes. Anyway, so we're looking at a surplus and managing a surplus. What I look at here is a legume in the stand, a yellow-blossomed alfalfa. You can see the darkness of green contributing to yield. And that's why I say with pastures, seeded to be pastures, I've got to have a legume in there. And that's a pet area because it's an area that we're looking at with a project we call the Sandfoin Project. It isn't just Sandfoin, it's higher legume pastures. I talk to some of the people I respect and say, how high a legume content do I need to get high carrying capacity, to get high profit? 40 to 60 is what I get back from a couple of the people that I really respect. I don't know if I don't have that, but you know, that's interesting. If I'm seeding down a pasture, maybe I'll look at some of the legumes like Sicer milk vetch. It doesn't have to be Sandfoin. Maybe it's yellow-blossomed alfalfa. Maybe it is even an Elsycon red clover, because they do set seeds in a longer grazing system management. We've got a number of partners we're working with on that project, and what I wanted to share with you is there, depending on where you come from, you'll find that there are places across Alberta that are doing work with grazing trials, looking at these higher legume pastures. When we finished the year-round grazing book back in 2006-07, the first thing the group said that was doing it, and that was the ERICA groups, the Forage and Applied Research Associations, is the next step's going to be higher legume grazing. We didn't get a chance to start that until later, and just 2 years ago. But again, looking at some of these things. And the reason why we're looking at that AC Mountain View Sandvoin, it's got tannins. They're bloat control, natural bloat control. So we're looking at putting it in with an alfalfa, and lo and behold, you have your cake and eat it too. If the animals start getting a little bit of a stomach pain, they eat the sandfoin. Grasses, of course, help too. Stocking rate, productivity, profitability. That's what we're looking at. And as I talk economic bottom line on pastures, I'm looking at a highly productive pasture that's got to have a legume in the game. All our pastures can't have legumes, but those pastures that we choose to, let's put them in there. Field residue. This area is really, to me, what I look at is almost an unfair advantage. So I wonder, why, like I tried to convince my brother, and he did for a couple of years until his son busted up the machine. They haven't put it back together. But I'll share with you a thought. When we start looking at those numbers, there is a handout on the side, and that handout talks about pea and oat straw residue. You're looking at their grazing days they had. They supplemented. But all said and done, we've got producers that are grazing. And I know the Foothills Forage and Grazing Association had some producers that were 45 grazing days, or is it even higher, Ben?
I can't remember.
45 grazing days after the grain's harvested per acre. So you're talking 45 grazing days per acre off of a grain field. Don't you wish that guy didn't harrow your wheat, Elvin? Yeah, you see, people do put cattle out there, but you don't want to be harrowing those fields first, as some people will do for you. You didn't understand what deal Elvin and Charlotte had made, but it's still part of that game where we can get a positive economic advantage. And really what it comes down to, the gentleman that, and I put this in because I wanted to say that your quality of forage is based on your color of combine. So your color of combine, your residue that's left behind, how well the cows are going to do there. I put all the colors in here because I didn't want anybody to be upset. But Greg Selzler sent me this picture, and he's going to be speaking here in February for us at the Ranching Opportunities event. So you'll hear him. He said, Grant, we didn't straw chaff bunch last year. And he sent me this fall, so here he is, he's bunching. He said, I'm back doing it. You know what? That was $250 per cow that I didn't put in my pocket. And it ain't going to happen again. Remember those numbers we were working at and we said it was such an advantage. That's what we find generally. And manure and urine, the guys are also saying the yields are better on these fields. Why? Material left on it, manure and urine put back on it year after year, and over time it does improve the land. The biggest thing I look at with the economic bottom line to swath grazing, do I have 5, Rick? Is that we have to seed early. We need a long growing season variety. That's why you hear a lot of us talking about triticale. Triticale because it's longer season than wheat. We wish the oats and barley were that long a season, but they haven't. And really, that's how we address it. Trying to seed something that's going to need a long season, give us the risk management from seeding in May, not the end of June, taking advantage of the spring moisture, taking advantage of giving us a high yield into the fall that we don't have to swath until into September. What that is doing, when we looked at the costs, we started originally, it was 47% savings, if I had it right, I think, of the swath grazing over conventional. What they found with it now is it's, instead of 37 to 60% savings. That's Vern's work, Vern Barron's work, sitting on the side there. Why? High production from seeding earlier. We found some of the advantages of let's seed consistently for high yield. Corn can do this too. We got to get the yield for it. When you start looking at it in the corn situation, it didn't fare at Lacombe as well as the triticale. But remember, that's where a lot of the breeding program for triticale was. Don Salmon, all his work was breeding triticale at Lacombe. So the varieties at Lacombe fit like a glove. Saskatchewan's not finding this favorably. It's in the handout on the side. It's on the foragebeef.ca website. If any of you kids want to take it down, you can take a picture. You're welcome to it. But remember, it's there for you to take it. I copied this off of the web internet anyway. I just went and took a snapshot of it, and as you can see where I got it. Swath grazed barley, it didn't give us the yield. That's why it dropped. It was back to 37% looking at that system. Traditional system, this is done 2000 and some numbers were held constants. 2014 data, traditional system was $1.98, including yardage and everything. Yardage now went up to $1.12 in that study. The thing I say watch for is these yardages. They're your yardage, they're not somebody else's. When Kathy Larson, who does so much of this work, I asked her, what is the yardage the producers you did across Saskatchewan were? She said to me, they were under $1 to over $2. Huh. Yardage, not feed costs, yardage for winter feeding. She said there was no average. They're not doing the cow-calf surveys anymore. Part of that is because you give you a really good number, but it's not even yours. It's not even close to it. And I sit there and go, I bet you mine's the $1. I'm sure it's yours that's $2. It wouldn't be mine. You know, but that's the point to it. We don't know if we don't know. With corn, it costs to put it in the ground. It costs to management. It is a red flag. However, though it's a red flag, that's where we really have to maximize yield. If we can maximize yield, corn will always be cheaper than traditional winter feeding, except if you're out at, we were talking Caroline or out west. You know, we don't get the corn heat units. That's a whole different story. But in general, corn should be a better advantage than conventional feeding. Why? Because cows have 4 legs, and Elvin's tractor costs $120 to repair. So that's the difference. And what you find there is what I want to show you here. This is corn. This is, again, current data, 2012 data, Western Beef Development Center. What they showed was that 300 days per acre of grazing, it costs 71 cents. 318 days per acre, 70 cents. That variety, that variety. That variety only had 145 days of grazing. It cost $1.42. That's the point. You got to get yield. Economic grazing bottom line, I've said again and again throughout this presentation, it has got to have yield. It's got to have carrying capacity to have stocking rates that are in line with it. It's got to have management to have carrying capacity from year to year. All of that was really what you see again and again. And this was a Foothills Forage and Grazing Association looking at annuals. These are some of the cocktail crops that they're growing, and they're trying to address the whole soil health. Plant it after you silage. Plant it after you've taken the green feed off. Grow green for a long part of the year. Increase carbon capture. Increase soil organic matter. Tell the consumer you're converting a lot of their carbon dioxide from their vehicles, their carbon monoxide maybe, from their vehicles they're running into the soil for them. Thank you kindly. And, you know, people always say to me, Grant, you know, what if the weather gets bad? You know, how many pictures of Highway 2 can you take? You know, that's the fact. Every year it gets bad. And the point is, what do we get in the end? I look at those systems and people say to me, you know, Grant, you have too much feed wastage in these systems. And I think to myself, yeah, they are wastage. But then I look at bale shredded on snow of 19. Oh. Bale unrolled. Oh. Bale shredded in the bunk. That's what we were saying to some of the people in the drought situations. We can't afford to put feed on the ground. By putting feed on the ground, we're adding waste to the system on a high-priced feed. We can't afford to do so. Burke Tykerd, and Burke's got an MBA. He's managed Deseret Ranches, I think, as the CEO, so that's the largest ranches, I think, in North America, well, the world, for that matter, because it's the Mormon ranch, so they've got ranches all over the place. And he said, just put your hat on backwards. And I like what he writes. He's got a neat approach to things. He said, we got to look at things differently. And if we look at things differently, the thing about that, they're going to really fit, I think, the future of what we're trying to do to stay in business, address the economic grazing bottom line. And so often we look at it as being in the beef business when we're really in the soil business. To me, I don't want to see sustainable, because a lot of our soils aren't being as sustainable as they could be. I'd rather see us improve them. That's where you're looking at a lot of this manure and urine back on the land. And really, when we look at that grazing the bottom line, it's land and people regenerating solutions. And that's the point, regenerating in terms of people coming back into agriculture, with land being there, more productive per acre. If it's worth so much, let's make it give us a return on investment in terms of organic matter in the soil and production above the ground that are in line for a long future in the business. That's it for my talk. Thank you.